Hi everyone, so for this video we're going to look at how to find zeros of a quadratic equation by factoring. Now before we can actually start the process, notice the way that this is written right now, it says f of x is equal to this. Now if you want to find the zeros of a quadratic equation, the first thing you need to make sure of is that it's actually set equal to 0. And then just as a side note, notice that I am writing this in standard form. So standard form looks like this. And what that means is I have put the highest exponent first, then the next highest, and so on. So you always want to start with the x squared term first. Alright, so there are a number of different ways where you can solve a quadratic equation, but they ask specifically for us to factor. So what we're going to do in factoring is, the first thing is look for GCF. So if I look at each of these terms here, is there a factor that I can pull out to make anything smaller or easier to manipulate later? And so the first thing I do is I look at the coefficients. So the coefficient here is a 1. So 1, 14, and 24. The biggest factor they have in common is a 1. And then the next thing I look at are your variables. So I have x squared, x, and then there's nothing here. So they don't share a common variable either, because not all three of the terms have an x. So your GCF here is 1. Well, that doesn't really help me, because if the GCF is 1, that means I can't really simplify any further just for that one factoring method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the product sum method. So notice there are 3 terms here. Okay, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create my ACB chart. So if you recall, your coefficients A, B, C. So in this case, A times C, so 1 times 24 gives me 24, and my B value is negative 14. So what I'm doing is I'm looking for factors of 24 that add up to 14. So the first thing is I encourage you to list out all your factors. So for instance, I tell my students to start with 1 times 24. So 1 times 24 works. Does 2 go in there? Well, let's see, 2 times 12 is 24. 3 times 8. And then I have 4 times 6. So that is pretty much all the factors. And how do I know? Because if I try 5, 5 doesn't go in nicely. And if I try 6, notice that 6 is on my list. So I've exhausted all those possibilities. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at these pairs here, and I'm going to see which pair could give me the negative 14 that I want. Okay? And so you can either add or subtract, but it has to satisfy both columns. So notice that the product is positive, but when I add or subtract them, it's negative. So what that means is that the signs have to be the same, because if I multiply a positive and a positive, I get a positive, and if I multiply a negative and a negative, I also get a positive. Okay? So looking at these pairs, I see that this one will satisfy that condition. So the only thing is, I need to make sure that they are both negative. So negative 2 times negative 12 gives me 24. Negative 2 plus negative 12 gives me the negative 14. So I know that's the pair that works. Okay, so let's go back. We have this. Alright, and I'm going to factor that. So if you recall, replace the middle term by the 2 that you say work. So negative 2x and negative 12x, right? Those come from right here. And bring everything else down. Okay, and then I am going to group, so I'm going to look at the first 2 and the last 2 here, and I'm going to pull out a GCF. So if I look at the first 2 terms, notice they have an x in common, so I'm going to pull that out. So let's see, if I take out an x, I have x minus 2. And if I look at the second 2 terms, they do not have an x in common, but I see 12 and 24. They do have a factor of 12 in common. And because this is negative here, I'm going to pull out a negative 12. So that gives me what? X minus 2. And you know you're on the right track when you've got two of the same thing here. And so remember, the outside pieces become 1, so I have x minus 12. And the thing they have in common is the other factor. And so now this is in factored form, which is great. Because now the last step is, if it's in factored form, we are going to take each factor and set it equal to 0. And then we're going to solve for x for each of those. So for here, I'm going to add 12. Here I'm going to add 2. And so I get x is 12. And I get x is 2. So that is how you can solve a quadratic by factoring. But like I said, that is only one method. Check out the other videos to learn how to do the quadratic formula and how to use the graphing method.